I'm Griffin Rowe, and here we explore the places where history leaves something behind. If you enjoy thoughtful stories about real events and the locations that hold their memory, consider subscribing, liking the video, and sharing it so more people can discover these stories. Now, some places do not move on. We do. Constantly. We rebuild, we rename, we install better lighting and cleaner signage and declare the whole thing revitalized. But certain coordinates on a map seem to resist that. You can pave over them. You can modernize them. You can put a gift shop in the lobby and a 4-star review on the website. And still, something lingers. Not a ghost. I want to be clear about that. I'm not talking about hauntings. I'm talking about something quieter. A density. A weight. As though history did not simply pass through, but settled. The way sediment settles at the bottom of a river, not because it chose to, but because gravity made the decision. Tonight we visit 5 coordinates where that weight is unmistakable. And at each one, I want to tell you a specific story, a true story, about a real person who passed through. Because places don't become heavy on their own. They become heavy, one life at a time. Can geography remember? I'm Griffin Rowe, and this is Places That Refuse to Forget. I'm standing roughly where they died, give or take a few meters. The arena floor is gone now. What you see below me is the infrastructure, the tunnels, the holding cells, the elevators that lifted animals and men up into the light. The Colosseum rises from Rome like something inevitable. Arches stacked upon arches, stone warmed by 2,000 years of sun. It looks almost peaceful now, this crumbling amphitheater full of tourists and pigeons and selfie sticks. But for nearly 400 years, this was a theater of blood. Gladiators, executions, animals imported from continents most Romans would never visit, killed in front of audiences who ate figs and placed bets. We tend to frame this as ancient brutality, something distant from us, primitive. And that framing is comforting. It lets us believe we've evolved past it. But here's what unsettles me about the Colosseum. It's not the violence, it's the engineering. The sightlines were designed so that every single spectator could see suffering clearly. No obstructed views, no bad seats. This was architecture in service of spectacle, and spectacle in service of control. Let me tell you about a man named Carpophorus. He was what the Romans called a bestiarius, a fighter of animals. Not gladiator against gladiator, man against beast. And Carpophorus was, by all surviving accounts, extraordinary at it. The poet Martial, who was essentially the entertainment columnist of 1st century Rome, wrote about Carpophorus with something between admiration and disbelief. In a single session, during the inaugural games of the Colosseum in 80 AD, Carpophorus reportedly killed a bear, a lion, and a leopard. On the same sand, in front of 50,000 people. Martial compared him to Hercules. And here's where this gets uncomfortable. Carpophorus was not a volunteer. He was almost certainly enslaved or condemned. The Romans did not distinguish clearly between performer and prisoner in the arena. His skill kept him alive. His fame made him valuable, but he did not choose this stage. He was extraordinary at something no one should have had to be extraordinary at. And 50,000 people watched and cheered and compared him to a god. And then they went home for dinner. That's what this place held. Not just violence, but the normalization of violence. The architecture of indifference. I was going to say the Colosseum is a ruin, but actually, I don't think it is. Ruins imply something finished, something that served its purpose and stopped. The Colosseum hasn't stopped. It just changed audiences. We still gather here. We still stare. We've just replaced the bloodshed with audio guides. Every mythology has a space like this. The arena, the pit, the place where civilization watches its own darkness and calls it sport. The Romans weren't inventing something new. They were scaling something ancient. Stone does not forget what it was shaped to hold. And we keep building amphitheaters. We just call them stadiums now. Although, that's probably too cynical. Or maybe it's not cynical enough. Standing here, I genuinely can't tell. Let's move to a place where the architecture wasn't designed for spectacle. It was designed for something worse: silence. This is what's left. About 3/4 of a mile of original wall, preserved here along the Spree River. It's covered in murals now. Color and defiance painted onto the surface of something that was built to be featureless. Berlin, August 1961. Overnight, concrete rises through a city. The Berlin Wall was not ancient. It was not beautiful. It was not mythic in any traditional sense. It was efficient, functional, cold. A line drawn in physical form through the middle of a living city. Families separated between breakfast and dinner. Streets severed. Windows bricked shut so people couldn't wave to their own neighbors. Unlike the Colosseum, which said, "Come watch," the wall said, "Stop." Its power was not in drama, it was in interruption. And here's the cruelty that I think gets overlooked. You could see the other side. That was the design. Not a mountain, not a river. A wall, low enough to know what you were missing, high enough that crossing it could kill you. Let me tell you about Peter Fechter. August 17th, 1962, 1 year after the wall went up. Peter was 18 years old, a bricklayer. He and a friend, Helmut Kuhlbeck, planned to cross together. They hid in a carpenter's workshop near the wall and waited. Then they ran. Kuhlbeck made it over. Peter did not. He was shot by East German border guards while climbing. He fell back onto the eastern side, into the death strip, that barren corridor between the two walls where no one was supposed to exist. And then something happened that I think defines this place more than any political speech or policy document. He lay there for nearly an hour. Western crowds screamed at the guards to do something. Eastern guards did nothing. Western guards could not cross without risking an international incident. And so an 18-year-old bricklayer bled to death in the most surveilled strip of land on Earth, watched by hundreds of people who were prevented by geography from saving him. He died in the space between two worlds, the literal no man's land that the wall created. Hundreds of people attempted to cross the wall over its 28 years. At least 140 died. But Peter Fechter's death became iconic because of that hour, because of the watching, because everyone saw and no one could act. The wall has been gone longer than it stood, 28 years up, 36 years down, as of now, and yet the line persists. You can still see economic differences between the east and west sides. Voting patterns diverge along the old border. Even satellite imagery at night shows a faint difference in streetlight color, warmer in the west, cooler in the east, because different bulbs were installed by different governments, and some have never been replaced. A wall that no longer exists still divides a city. That's not a haunting. That's something more interesting than a haunting. It's a scar that became part of the anatomy. I keep reaching for metaphors, scars, lines, ghosts. But actually, maybe the most honest thing I can say about standing here is that you can feel where the wall was, the way you can feel where a tooth was pulled. The structure is gone. The ache has a shape. Peter Fechter was 18. He laid bricks for a living. And he died in a strip of dirt because someone drew a line and said this side and that side are now different countries. Some places absorb division so deeply that even after demolition, the boundary remains. Invisible, but felt. This next place didn't choose its story. That's what makes it different from everything we've talked about so far. This is Pripyat. Population 0. Well, that's not entirely true. There are wolves now, and wild horses, and more bird species than most nature reserves in Europe. Life has returned here, just not human life. April 26, 1986. Chernobyl nuclear power plant, about 3 kilometers from where I'm standing. An explosion that did not look like war. No invading army, no visible enemy, no fire in the sky, just a reactor test gone wrong. An error compounded by arrogance, compounded by a system that punished people for reporting problems. And then something invisible, radiation, released into the air and soil and water and everything. Pripyat was evacuated within 36 hours. Residents were told they would return in 3 days. They packed light. They never went back. I want to tell you about the firefighters, about Vasily Ignatenko. Vasily was 25 years old, a firefighter stationed near the plant. When the explosion happened in the early hours of April 26th, he and his crew were among the first responders. They were told there had been a roof fire at the reactor. A roof fire. They were not told about the radiation. They were not given protective equipment. They went in wearing standard uniforms. Vasily and his crew climbed onto the roof of the reactor building. The graphite beneath them was exposed and burning. The air itself was toxic, in ways that wouldn't become clear for hours. His wife, Ludmila, has given interviews about what followed. She was pregnant at the time. When she arrived at the hospital in Moscow, where Vasily had been transferred, she barely recognized him. The doctors told her not to touch him. She touched him anyway. She held him. Vasily Ignatenko died on May 13, 1986. He was 25. I need to pause here, because I was going to connect this to mythology, to Prometheus, maybe, the man who reached for fire and was destroyed by it. But that feels wrong. Prometheus chose. Vasily was sent. He didn't reach for anything. He was told to go to a roof. And he went, because that was his job. There's no mythic framework that makes that okay. Sometimes a story is just a story about a 25-year-old who was not given the information he needed to survive. And the place where it happened is still here, still quiet, still waiting for residents who will never come home. Time here feels arrested. And I keep reaching for the word haunted, but that's not right either. Haunted implies a presence, something lingering that shouldn't be there. Pripyat is the opposite. It's defined by absence, by the people who should be there and aren't. Actually, maybe the better word is paused, as though someone pressed stop on a city and never pressed play again, and the tape just sits there, degrading slowly, but holding its shape. Every mythology has a version of this. The city struck down, Sodom, Pompeii, Atlantis. We keep telling stories about places erased by their own hubris, because we keep sensing, correctly, that it could happen again. But Vasily Ignatenko wasn't hubristic. He was a firefighter. He showed up for work. Chernobyl isn't a parable about arrogance. Or, no, it is. But not the arrogance of the people who lived here. The arrogance of the systems above them. The arrogance of certainty. Of telling people a roof fire is just a roof fire. Of telling a city, 3 days, when you mean forever. Places that freeze mid-motion carry a particular kind of gravity. One morning you're packing lunches. By afternoon, your home is a monument to someone else's miscalculation. Let's go somewhere with no land at all. 3,800 meters below the surface of the North Atlantic. The darkness down here isn't like nighttime. Nighttime ends. This doesn't. This is the absence of light as a permanent condition. A place the sun has never reached. When the Titanic launched in 1912, it represented modernity at its most confident. Electric lighting, a grand staircase, a swimming pool, orchestras. The illusion of invincibility made tangible in steel and walnut and crystal. Unsinkable. That word was actually used by engineers in print. It sank on its maiden voyage. Over 1,500 people died in water cold enough to kill in minutes. There are many stories from the Titanic. Too many. But the one I want to tell you is about the musicians. The ship's band was led by Wallace Hartley, a 33-year-old violinist from Lancashire, England. There were 8 of them. They played in the first-class lounge. They were not crew in the official sense. They were contracted through an agency. This matters, because when the ship began to sink, they had no assigned lifeboat, no station, no protocol. They played anyway. As the ship listed and the lifeboats were lowered, and the North Atlantic crept across the deck, Hartley and his musicians set up near the grand staircase and played. Survivors gave conflicting accounts of what they played. Some said waltzes. Some said ragtime. The popular legend is that the last piece was the hymn "Nearer My God to Thee." Hartley had reportedly told a friend years earlier that if he were ever on a sinking ship, that's what he'd play. Whether he actually did is debated. What is not debated is that the band played as the ship went down. Not because anyone ordered them to, not because it would save anyone, but because, and I thought about this a lot, I think it was the only thing they could do that made sense. When everything is ending and you can't stop it, you play the thing you know. Wallace Hartley's body was recovered from the Atlantic 10 days later. His violin case was strapped to his chest. That detail, the case strapped to his chest, he chose to take it with him, into the water, into the cold. I was going to say that's heroic, and maybe it is, but actually I think heroic is too grand, too clean. I think it was something smaller and more human than heroism. I think it was a man holding on to the thing that made him who he was, because everything else was already gone. The ocean did not erase the Titanic. It archived it. Underwater, decay moves on a different clock. The ship rusts slowly. Bacterial formations called rusticles hang from the hull like strange chandeliers. Marine life drifts through corridors that once held champagne toasts and string quartets. And every expedition to the wreck becomes another layer of story deposited on top of the original. Scientists, filmmakers, tourists, each visit adds to the myth. The Greeks would have recognized this story instantly. They had a word for it, hubris, and they knew it always ended the same way. The only variable was timing. A place that once symbolized technological triumph now symbolizes fragility. And it does this from a depth no human can survive unaided. Which feels, I don't know, almost deliberate. As though the ocean is making a point about access, about what we're allowed to see and what we have to earn. Although that's me being poetic. The ocean isn't making a point. The ocean doesn't care. But Wallace Hartley strapped his violin to his chest. And that I care about. This last one has no ancient mythology, no grand catastrophe. And that's exactly why it might be the most disturbing of all. This is the Cecil Hotel, or it was. It's been renamed, rebranded. The owners have tried, more than once, to separate the building from its story. It hasn't worked. The Cecil Hotel opened in 1924 as a destination. Brand lobby, ornate fixtures, 600 rooms. The kind of place that believed in its own future. It was not ancient like Rome, not ideological like Berlin, not catastrophic like Chernobyl, not mythic like the Titanic. It was ordinary, and that is what makes it the most unsettling location on this list. Over the decades, the Cecil became associated with suicides, unsolved deaths, violence, instability. Serial killers stayed here. Richard Ramirez during his killing spree in 1985. Jack Unterweger in 1991. Not as a destination, as a convenience. It was cheap. It was anonymous. It was the kind of place where no one asked questions because no one wanted the answers. But the story I want to tell you is about Elisa Lam. February 2013. Elisa was a 21-year-old Canadian student traveling alone along the West Coast. She checked into the Cecil, which was operating partly as a budget hotel, partly as a hostel. On January 31st, she disappeared. Weeks later, guests began complaining about low water pressure and a strange taste in the water. On February 19th, a maintenance worker opened one of the rooftop water tanks. Elisa Lam's body was inside. The investigation that followed raised more questions than it answered. Surveillance footage from the elevator, released by the LAPD, showed Elisa behaving erratically in the hours before her disappearance, pressing multiple buttons, stepping in and out, appearing to speak to someone who wasn't visible. The footage went viral. Millions watched. Theories multiplied. Paranormal, criminal, conspiratorial. The coroner's report ultimately ruled her death an accidental drowning, complicated by bipolar disorder. The evidence pointed to a mental health crisis, alone, in a building with roof access and water tanks that were remarkably unmonitored. And here is where the Cecil does what the Cecil always does. It takes a tragedy that has a human explanation, a young woman in crisis, failed by circumstance and infrastructure, and it transforms it into legend. Because that's what happens when a building has enough dark history. Every new event gets absorbed into the existing mythology. Context becomes narrative. Coincidence becomes pattern. I was going to say that's the building's fault, but actually it isn't. It's ours. We're the ones who turned Elisa Lam's death into content, into podcasts and documentaries and Reddit threads. We couldn't let a 21-year-old's mental health crisis be what it was. We needed it to be part of the Cecil story. Because the Cecil story is more interesting to us than the truth. And I think that might be the most uncomfortable thing I've said all episode. This is the one that challenges my framework the most. Because the Colosseum was designed for violence. The wall was designed for division. Chernobyl was a single catastrophic rupture. The Titanic was a parable that wrote itself. The Cecil is none of those things. It's just a building where too many dark stories happen to converge. And that convergence created something that feels almost sentient but isn't. It's narrative mass. Enough stories in one place that the place itself starts to feel like a character. I was going to say the Cecil is the least mythic location on this list. But now I'm not sure. Because what is mythology if not the accumulation of stories until a place or a person becomes larger than fact? The Cecil might be the most mythic of all five. It's just myth built from newspaper clippings instead of poetry. Because mythology isn't always marble and torchlight. Sometimes it's a 600-room hotel on Main Street where people check in and the stories never check out. I immediately regret that phrasing, but I'm keeping it. So, do places remember? Not in a mystical sense. Stone does not think. Concrete does not dream. Water does not grieve. But we do. And when thousands, sometimes millions of people attach the same meaning to the same coordinates, that meaning becomes spatial. Places don't create these forces. They collect them. And when enough stories gather in one place, the place begins to feel like the source. But it isn't. It's a container. And we are what fills it. The Colosseum reminds us how easily violence becomes entertainment. The wall reminds us how quickly a line can divide. Chernobyl reminds us that systems fail quietly before they fail loudly. The Titanic reminds us that confidence is not the same as certainty. The Cecil reminds us that instability accumulates, and that we are often more interested in the mythology of tragedy than in the people inside it. These places refuse to forget, because we refuse to stop telling their stories. And perhaps that's the deeper truth, one that mythology figured out long before geography did. History does not live in time, it lives in space. It settles, it gathers, it waits.
Brought to you by Inception Point AI. Subscribe, like, and comment for more.